Legal limbo. That's where one new law is currently following a week of legal action in an ongoing story involving absentee ballots. Hello and welcome to Empire State Weekly. I'm Jamie DeLine in Albany. New York's November midterm election is just over a week away, and the legal situation around a new absentee ballot law continues to develop. A stay has been issued on a new law that allows the Board of Elections to count absentee ballots before Election Day. Republicans oppose this law, calling it unconstitutional, and they're suing the state over it. The new law was meant to speed up the process. A judge is siding with the plaintiffs, saying that the new law is unconstitutional. In the meantime, voters can continue to fill out and send in their absentee ballots. In addition to claiming the law is unconstitutional, one Republican lawmaker explains it's also unnecessary.
There are a lot of safeguards that are in place for absentee ballots. What we want to do is make sure that those safeguards remain in place because the pandemic is over and we need to get back to normal procedures for elections to ensure that one citizen gets one vote.
Joining us now to break down the latest on this lawsuit, we're joined by Susan Lerner from the political watchdog group Common Cause New York. Now, Susan, when it comes to this lawsuit, there's a few aspects to it. The plaintiffs are saying fear of getting COVID should no longer be an excuse to vote absentee, and they're also claiming that a new election law passed last year, which allows ballots to be counted by the Board of Elections before Election Day, is unconstitutional. Now, I know that there is a lot to unpack here, but Susan, first, can you explain why this new law was enacted in the first place?
The new law was enacted because people complained that it took too long to get accurate results because of the delay in counting absentee ballots. So the legislature responded to that by conforming New York's practices regarding how to canvass, how to process how to process absentee ballots to conform with 39 other states across the country who open up absentee ballots in advance of Election Day so people can get a more accurate count of the results on election night.
Now, I know that Republican Assemblyman Robert Smallin, who is a plaintiff in the case, told me that he wants the law to go back to how it was previously. So when it comes to the specific issue, a judge sided with the plaintiffs, saying that canvassing votes before Election Day is unconstitutional, and appeals have been filed. Your organization, Common Cause New York, as well as the AG's office and others, wanted to stay in the case, which recently was granted. How does the stay impact this case moving forward?
Well, what the stay does is it clarifies that the current state of the law is the procedure that the county boards of elections have to follow. But I want to emphasize that this doesn't change how people actually are able to get absentee ballots and whether their absentee ballots will count. It's a question of the procedure that'll be followed and how quickly the count will happen. But it doesn't change voters' ability to use an absentee ballot.
So they can still cast their ballots, fill it out, send it in, and nothing happens with them specifically.
That's correct. You have the right to get an absentee ballot if you've satisfied the requirements, which includes temporary illness, a definition if you have concerns about voting in person that you could get sick. That's a valid basis for getting an absentee ballot. Your absentee ballot is going to be processed. And your vote, if you're an eligible voter, your vote's going to count.
What else do you think voters need to know before Election Day?
Well, what voters need to know is that we now in New York allow voters to determine when it's best for them to go and vote. You can still get an absentee ballot by going to your county board of elections and filling it out. But the time to request an absentee ballot by mail is long past. What you do have is the ability to vote in person early. And in Albany and Rensselaer County, early voting starts across the state tomorrow, Saturday, and the hours in the two counties are identical. 9 to 5 on Saturday and Sunday, 9 to 5 during the week, except Monday and Wednesday, noon to 8. So if you need to vote later in the day, and then you would want to vote early on Monday or Wednesday. Otherwise, it's 9 to 5, and you can go to any early voting location in your county. So if you're an Albany resident, you can pick an early voting location that's convenient to you anywhere in the county.
And when it comes to this lawsuit, we know an appeal has been filed and that it's being brought up on next Tuesday. Can you talk a little bit about what you guys are hoping will happen?
Well, I think what has to happen is that no one should be encouraged to bring last-minute lawsuits trying to disrupt our elections. It really feels like this lawsuit was filed to confuse voters, to discourage them from voting. And that's simply wrong. There should not be any last-minute challenges. The law that's being challenged was passed in 2021. We've had 2 primaries that were run under this law, and it really raises significant questions why anybody would wait until 2 or 3 weeks before election day to try and change procedures. It seems to be a desire to confuse voters and to discourage them from voting, and that's bad for our democracy, and that's not the way our election should be conducted.
And we already had 2 primaries previously this year, and this new law was in place and it wasn't challenged then.
Exactly. So why wait? Unless your goal is to create, manufacture chaos, confuse voters, and discourage them from voting. So I want to emphasize, if you have already sent in your absentee ballot, you're fine. If you get your absentee ballot in the mail, you can still fill it out and send it back in. And the change in the law, which says if you've got an absentee ballot, if you go and vote in person, you'll vote by affidavit ballot, not on the machines, is still in place. So if you do have an absentee ballot, fill it out, send it back in. Chances are it's definitely going to be counted. But if you don't have an absentee ballot, make your voting plan. Are you going to vote early? Are you going to vote on election day? And bring family and friends. Voting is a social occasion. It's the way in which we strengthen our democracy and we have our voices heard. So bring family and friends who are voters as well, and make it into a celebration of our democracy.
Well, Susan, thank you so much for joining us. We really appreciate it.
Thank you so much. And go vote, everybody. And remember, flip the ballot. There are proposals on the back.
The candidates in New York's race for governor take to the debate stage. When we return, we break down the one and only debate this race. We'll talk about the issues being debated and who came out looking the best. Welcome back to Empire State Weekly. I'm Jamie DeLine in Albany. This week, the 2 candidates for New York governor facing off in their first and only debate before Election Day. Current Governor Kathy Hochul and Republican challenger Lee Zeldin pushing their stances on some of the biggest issues facing voters this year. Take a listen.
There are criminals out there who need to pay the consequences for their action instead of the catch-release policies that Kathy Hochul champions.
What I have proposed to work with Mayor Adams was more cops. We'll support him with our state resources, cameras in the subways, as well as care for the people who are severely, severely mentally ill.
To help us get a greater perspective after the first gubernatorial debate, we're joined by Grant Rear, who is a professor of political science at Syracuse University's Maxwell School. Thank you so much for joining us.
Well, thanks for having me on the program.
Now, during the first and only scheduled gubernatorial debate, Democratic Governor Kathy Hochul and Republican Congressman Lee Zeldin went head-to-head talking about a wide variety of topics, including crime and abortion. Overall, what were your biggest takeaways of the debate?
Well, you mentioned crime, and I think one of the things that I noticed was almost every time that Kathy Hochul got a question about crime or there was a follow-up on that, she talked about the gun control measures that she's been able to pass. And I thought that was kind of a miss in a way, because the concerns that people have in the state of New York about crime are about violent crime, particularly in New York City, but violent crime everywhere, and particularly, again, in urban areas all over the state. And that's a different kind of crime than what those measures were designed to get at. And so I don't know if that really answered people's concerns in that regard. Now, maybe, you know, she wants to emphasize the things that she's been able to accomplish, and I understand that that would be where she would go. But I think there was a bit of an evasion of the concerns about bail reform, and which she did address at one point. But I thought that could have been done in a more strong way from her, more direct way from her. Certainly, abortion was a big issue, and it is something that she has been very keen to paint Lee Zeldin as someone who is a threat to abortion rights. Lee Zeldin tried to take the terrain that he has been pushing in his campaign, that while he is personally opposed to abortion, he does not want to see as governor. He's not interested in seeing or trying to push any kind of rollback on what the protections are in New York State. That may be difficult for some people to believe, and I think that Kathy Hochul, as governor, is trying to raise suspicions about that. And then there's also a broader national conversation that's going on about that issue that she's trying to tap into. And certainly it's been something that has energized Democrats. So she's keen on that.
And speaking of abortion, this is a topic that the governor has really focused her campaign on. Do you think this was a smart strategy? Should she focus on other issues instead?
Well, that's the big question for Democrats in this midterm election. It's going to be a big question for congressional candidates for Democrats, and it's also going to be a big question for her. It's a tricky one in New York, because in New York, we do have these protections that are codified into law, and I don't think they're going anywhere anytime soon. It's not likely that the Assembly would flip Republican anytime really in the foreseeable future, and so that pretty much means that there's not going to be any meaningful changes in those laws of a restrictive nature. Whether it works as an issue for the governor's race, then, it's hard to say. It just depends on how much Democrats are generally energized by this issue, how much independents who are concerned about the issue take to heart the worries and the risks that Kathy Hochul is trying to put onto Lee Zeldin and internalize those. It's something that obviously Republicans are not going to be emphasizing. It's not something that's putting the wind in their sails right now, although you have seen some pro-life groups get very energized by the Dobbs decision, but not in the state of New York as much. And so it's, I don't know. I can't give you a crisp answer to that. I think it's risky. Let me put it that way. I think it's a risky strategy.
And during the debate, Governor Hochul was talking about former President Trump. We know that Donald Trump has endorsed Lee Zeldin, and Zeldin voted against certifying the 2020 election. When asked if he would like to see Trump run for president in 2024, Zeldin said he wasn't even thinking about it. Could Zeldin's prior relationship to President Trump hurt him here in New York State, or is that relationship irrelevant at this time?
I think the answer is it really could, and I frankly am surprised because of that, in particular, that the race is tightening in the way it is. That speaks volumes to concerns about the economy in New York, inflation, and crime, because I think those have to be really big concerns for them to outweigh this one piece of luggage that he has, which I would have thought really would have dragged him down. And I said this during the primary stage. I thought the Republicans would have been better served strategically to nominate someone without the attachment to Trump. Now, you can make the argument that, he's running for governor. He's not running for Congress. He's not running to be part of a presidential administration. And so in that regard, then it's a different set of questions that we need to be thinking about and a different set of concerns. But Trump is just in New York State so toxic for so many voters, not only among Democrats, but among those independents as well, even some Republicans, that I'm surprised that the race is as tight as it is. So I would have thought, yes, it would have been something that would have dragged him down.
And ultimately, what do you think both candidates need to do to get the undecided vote?
Well, first of all, there are very few undecided voters when we really boil it down. Even those that call themselves independents, most of them pretty habitually vote for candidates of one party for the other. But if we're talking about that small group, say 7% that are genuinely undecided, I think the big issues have been made clear. Then the fact that this race is tightening. It's the economy, It is inflation, which is part of the economy. It is concerns about still where the economy is going in the future. It's about jobs leaving New York. It's about people leaving New York and losing congressional seats. All of those things are tied to the economy and the level of spending and taxes. You don't have to be a conservative to be concerned about the level of spending and taxes in New York State. We're always at the top in that regard, and it seems to be having a negative effect on the population and on some of the very basis of the livelihood of the state. And then there's crime, and there has been an uptick in crime and violent crime, and that's of concern too. So I think they need to be focusing on those issues and convincing those few genuinely undecided and unleaning voters that they have the better path forward for dealing with those things. Just one quick last thing is, when Kathy Hochul came into office, there was a lot of enthusiasm for her as the first woman governor and as the first upstate governor in almost a century, and a hope for change. I think one of the things that can be said about her is I do not see her at this point as a change agent for New York State. And I think that is maybe one of the reasons why this race is tightening, because there are a lot of citizens in New York State that want to see change writ large. They want to see something change about Albany. And I think they've become less convinced that she is the person that will be that agent of change.
Now, do you think that there was a topic that wasn't brought up in the debate that should have been brought up? And what are your thoughts on that?
That's a great question. There wasn't a whole lot about the environment and climate change, but also just generally about protecting the environment in New York. It's a big concern upstate. Water is our most precious resource. It's why often companies that do locate here cite as a reason for locating here is the abundance of good quality water. So we didn't hear a whole lot about that. We didn't hear about the protection of wilderness that we have in public land in the state of New York, and concerns about like overcrowding in the Adirondacks with people visiting it and hikers and what to do about that. So those are some of the things I thought you might have heard more. Wasn't a lot about education funding, and that's a huge issue for New York State. And there wasn't a lot about the Medicaid program, which is a huge issue for New York State's budget. It's the single biggest item in the budget. And we spend per capita more than double what California spends on its Medicaid program. And that's another liberal state. So I was surprised there wasn't more questions about those kinds of things.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much for joining us. We really appreciate it.
It was my pleasure. Thanks for having me on.
New Yorkers could be facing a triple threat of health risks this winter. Increasing cases of RSV are adding to a potentially bad flu season, all while coronavirus still poses a threat. What state officials are doing to keep New Yorkers safe. Welcome back to Empire State Weekly. I'm Jamie DeLine in Albany. Some are calling it a triple threat. With colder months approaching, we could see an increase in flu, RSV, and COVID cases. This week, Governor Hochul updating New Yorkers on what the state is doing to prepare. Capitol correspondent Amel Talegi has the latest.
As of Monday, 3 million New Yorkers have received the flu shot. Governor Hochul and the Department of Health are urging New Yorkers to get the shot if they haven't done so already. This can be done at your doctor's office or at a pharmacy. Another virus on the rise is respiratory syncytial virus, known as RSV, a common respiratory virus that causes mild cold-like symptoms. It can be dangerous for infants and children younger than 5. Dr. James Saperstone says all 3 viruses are expected.
I think instead of calling it a triple threat, we've got to tone everything down because it just gets people upset. And it's never as bad as we think it is.
Saperstone says the reason for the uptick in all 3 viruses is because the seasons have been off since COVID, and immune systems, especially for children, are adjusting now that kids are back in school. The state currently has pediatric beds for non-ICU capacity at 25%. So what are some preventative measures we can take?
Reminding people of good hygiene, respiratory hygiene, cover the cough, wash your hands, keep children and yourself home when you're sick. And of course, we do have vaccines for influenza and for COVID, and we need people to get their shots.
And when it comes to COVID-19, cases are down, but it's still an issue. Just yesterday, there were 34 COVID-related deaths.
But now we have the new vaccine, the bivalent booster is especially effective against Omicron, because here's what I have to make sure people don't think. If you got your shot, you got your booster a while back, I got it last year, I'm all good. No. You need to get it updated.
You can find the latest information on viruses and vaccines at health.ny.gov. Reporting in Albany, Amel Talegi.
Stick around and we'll be back with a look at the week ahead in just a moment. Finally on Empire State Weekly, the midterm elections in New York are just over 1 week away. Early voting already taking place, with voters allowed to turn in absentee ballots. The early voting period lasts over a week, running through next Sunday. Election Day is November 8th, and we will continue to cover the latest leading up to and beyond the election. For now, from all of us here on Empire State Weekly, I'm Jamie DeLine in Albany. We'll see you next week. And don't forget, you can watch Empire State Weekly all over New York State. Here's the full schedule of Empire State Weekly on 10 television stations across New York.